All right, so what I want to do today is I want to look at the model of the kidney, and then we're going to actually blow up pieces of the kidney in terms of making them larger, and then looking at, well, I've got two more things on this model. So the first thing we're going to look at is the kidney itself. So the kidney has three major regions, which we looked at when we dissected the kidney. We have the cortex, which is the outer region, the medulla, which is basically the middle region, and then this funnel-shaped region here is the pelvis. That is then going to be continuous with the ureter here. So we can see part of that ureter in this location between my fingers here. So when we talk about the kidney, remember that our cortex is mainly where those nephrons are going to be. So we see these little yellow things on the kidney here. That's actually the renal corpuscle. We see some blood vessels here. We see the renal pyramids. We see the minor calyces, the major calyces, the renal pelvis. We see all of those things. And down here is actually what the renal pelvis, or what the renal pyramids look like. Remember that they're triangular, so they are actually 3D. They're not this flat structure that we see when we dissect the kidney, but they are actually three-dimensional. So when we talk about the kidney and its function in producing urine, we're going to really focus on the microscopic anatomy, which are the nephrons. So here you see these white tubes. That's all part of the renal tubule. Then over here with the yellow is the renal corpuscles, and you can actually see we have a bunch of blood vessels here. Okay, so let's talk about the nephrons themselves, and you notice they're mainly in the cortex. Some of it is in that renal pyramid. So we're going to move on to our next portion of our model, which is this right here. So again, we have our cortex up here. We have our renal pyramids here, which is part of the renal medulla. And if you notice down here on the renal pyramids, you'll notice the first part of those minor calyces, but you'll also notice some holes here. Okay, we're going to talk about those holes here in a second. So when we talk about our nephrons, remember our nephrons are microscopic, and we have two types. We have cortical nephrons, which are completely in the cortex, and then we have the juxtamedullary nephrons, which means that they're in the cortex, but they also have these long loops of Henle, or these nephron loops, that are going to be part of the nephron itself. So when we're looking at these structures, we basically have two major structures of the nephrons. We have what's known as the renal corpuscle, which is this little piece right here, these pieces here with the yellow and the red, and then we have the renal tubule, which is in white, and then we have this really, really long structure. It's not part of the nephron, but we're going to talk about it as well. So when we talk about the nephrons themselves, remember we have to talk about the fact that they are filtering, they're going through glomerular filtration, so they're filtering the blood. Then they're going through tubular reabsorption, which means they're reabsorbing substances that were pulled out back into the blood. And then we have tubular secretion, which means we're going to take stuff that's still in the blood that needs to be removed from the body, and that's going to go to the renal tubule. So when we talk about these structures, we have two major parts again: renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. So the renal corpuscle actually consists of the glomerulus, this little red thing here. That is a knot of capillaries. Those capillaries are going to filter the blood. That's then going to go into the little yellow part here, which is a C-shaped, almost like a cup-shaped region. That's the glomerular capsule. So whatever gets filtered out of the blood is going to go into that glomerular capsule, and it's going to be termed filtrate. It's been filtered out of the blood, so it is now filtrate. That filtrate is then going to move into the renal tubule. The first part of the renal tubule is the proximal convoluted tubule, and I want you to think of the name. Proximal means closer to the point of origin. That's the origin of the renal tubule, so it's the first part. Convoluted just means that it's not straight. You notice that it has all these twists and turns to it. The second part is the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop. So it's this large hairpin turn. And then the last part is the distal convoluted tubule. So we notice on this one, it's not as convoluted as the proximal on the model, but it is just as kinked and just as twisty and turny as the proximal convoluted tubule. So those are all parts of the nephron. We have the glomerular capsule, the glomerulus itself, proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, and then the distal convoluted tubule. So this long tube here, and if we follow these, will actually lead to these little holes at the bottom here. These are the collecting ducts. The collecting ducts, what's happening with them is they are collecting filtrate from multiple nephrons. So we see how a nephron here and a nephron here. Notice how it's collecting those from both of those nephrons. So it's going to collect that filtrate from these nephrons, and then it's going to send it to and through that renal pyramid and then into the minor calyces. So that's kind of where our urine filtration is, or urine production is going to occur. So when we talk about this, I want to talk about basically the three processes. When we talk about filtration, we're talking about the glomerulus is filtering the blood. So this guy here is filtering our blood. And then we have the first part, which is tubular reabsorption. So what we're doing is we're actually going to send that filtrate through the proximal convoluted tubule first. Well, the thing is, the glomerulus is a really, really good filter. So it's going to filter out everything. That includes water, that includes, glucose, includes everything that we may actually still need. So most of our reabsorption, us taking that back and pushing it into the blood so we can take it back to the body, is going to occur in the proximal convoluted tubule. And the way that reabsorption takes place is we move from the renal tubule to these capillaries here. So you notice how we have these capillaries here that are surrounding the renal tubule. Those capillaries are the peritubular capillaries. So those peritubular capillaries are reabsorbing substances from the renal tubule back into the blood so we can take it back to the body. Once we go through that process, we're then going to go through tubular secretion. So after we go through filtration and reabsorption, we're going to go through secretion. And secretion usually happens more often in the distal convoluted tubule and in the nephron loop. And what's happening with secretion is that maybe we still have substances in our blood that we need to get rid of. So we're going to go from the blood, the peritubular capillaries that have those substances, and they're going to push them back into the renal tubule because the renal tubule is going to move out of the body eventually. So we're going to get rid of it with urine. So when we talk about these structures, I want to talk more in depth about the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. So you notice that this little piece over here, the yellow and the red, is actually this that's been blown up. So here we have our little knot of capillaries. This is our glomerulus. And you notice the glomerulus, which is red, is covered in kind of a pinkish or orangish yellowish color. These are the podocytes. So the podocytes are actually reinforcing the walls, but they're also creating these little structures here, these little channels, which are called filtration slits. And so what they're able to do is, as that blood comes into the glomerulus, we have to have high enough pressure. So pressure inside a capillary is usually not a good thing because remember, our capillaries are made up of simple squamous epithelium. So those capillaries are essentially going to have to deal with high pressure. So the podocytes are doing two things. They're helping reinforce the wall, but they're also helping to create an area for filtration. So our glomerulus is our filter. So the way that blood comes to the glomerulus is, I want you to remember our arcuate arteries over the top of the renal pyramids. So from the arcuate arteries, we're going to move into these cortical radiate arteries, okay? So these are the arteries that are radiating into the cortex. And from there, we're going to go into an afferent arteriole, which is this guy here. Afferent means it's approaching. So this guy is approaching the glomerulus. So that blood is coming from the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus. And I want you to remind you that whenever we go to a capillary, we usually are fed with an arteriole and then drained with a venule. But the thing is, because we have two sets of capillaries, we have the glomerulus and the peritubular capillaries. The afferent arteriole is supplying blood to the glomerulus is filtering that blood, and the blood that's leaving is leaving via another arteriole, this time the efferent arteriole. Remember, efferent means exiting. So that efferent arteriole is then going to feed into the peritubular capillaries. So when we look at this here, cortical radiate artery goes into the afferent arteriole, into the glomerulus, out the efferent arteriole, and then into the peritubular capillaries. So we have one capillary that's going to feed into another set of capillaries, which is why the glomerulus is drained with an efferent arteriole. So whatever is filtered out of the glomerulus has to be caught. So this thing here that kind of looks like a cup is the glomerular capsule. The glomerular capsule is going to catch all of the filtrate that is being formed, everything that's being filtered out of the glomerulus. The glomerular capsule is going to basically capture, grab onto, and then it's going to move it into the proximal convoluted tubule. So this part here. From the proximal convoluted tubule, again, we're going to go through the nephron loop into the distal convoluted tubule, and then we're going to go into the collecting ducts. The collecting ducts are the ones that are going to move it through the renal pyramid and into the minor calyces. So most of our reabsorption I mentioned takes place in our proximal convoluted tubule. We have some throughout the tract, but most of it occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts, these two are targeted by hormones. Hormones are usually going to target them and either tell them to reabsorb things, which means they're going to push it back into the blood, or to secrete things, in which case they're going to take it from the peritubular capillaries, which is the blood, into the renal tubule to get rid of it. So our hormones usually target those two areas, either the distal convoluted tubule or the collecting duct. So whenever we talk about a hormone, those are the two areas that they're going to target.